we were not in it. And we called Representative Lash. He went to the speaker, came back to me and said, "What are you talking about? The speaker says it's in the bill." I said, "John, it's not in the bill." So he came running down to the hearing. Senator Marty came running down to the hearing. The governor's staff came running down to the hearing. We had the Commissioner of Agriculture came running into the hearing. And I think one of the most fun moments in this, and there wasn't a lot of fun, but one of the most fun moments of this was the governor issued a one-page, and I wish we had it, darn it, a one-page document to the legislature. And it listed, it was very basic. It wasn't meant for public consumption, and it had 6 items that the governor said, "I must have these 6 items before this session is done, or we're not ending." These are must-have. And I can't remember all the 6 items, but the 6th item on there was pass the dog and cat breeder law and fully fund it. And that was amazing. I mean, there were people running around the Capitol going, "What in the world?" The governor's saying he's not going to end the session until he gets the dog and cat breeder law. And we were, "Yep, that's right." So that was really it. And again, if there's one person that I think, in my mind, put us over the top, I think it would have to be Governor Dayton. So we're very, very appreciative. Yeah, you can. And then the bill passed again. And again, that wasn't controversial because it was in the big budget, though. So it wasn't like it was a standalone bill on the House floor. So we knew that the bill, once we were in there, once we were safely in there, we knew that we'd be okay. Oh, gosh, 4. Okay, and then the governor signed the bill, and that was very, 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 very exciting. And he was able to have a little ceremony where he invited a number of the advocates to that, and that was great. More work to do, and that is true. Okay, go ahead.
All right, after the law. Now we have the law, and the Board of Animal Health begins their registration. They did decide to start inspecting and licensing during the 1-year period where it was a registration only. The board created an advisory committee, and that advisory committee was to work on veterinary protocol and inspection guidelines. To date, I think they've met twice with that advisory committee. And then we're going to go into the law. The law requires that the board inspect and license breeders and enforce the law. It applies to, as I had mentioned earlier, people who have possession or ownership interest in animals and is engaged in the business of breeding animals for sale or for exchange. So it doesn't cover people who are breeding animals for show, for example. And who possess 10 or more adult intact animals. And so you have to meet all these thresholds in order to fall under the law. And whose animals produce more than 5 total litters of puppies or kittens per year. So in a nutshell, it's 10 or more adult animals producing more than 5 litters. If you've got 9, you aren't covered under this law. You will not be inspected by the board. That doesn't mean that the board can't go in and inspect to see if you have 10 or more, but you wouldn't be required to be licensed.
And that number piece was, as Nancy mentioned earlier, was very important, and it took a lot of negotiating to get to that number. There were a number of legislators that were concerned that if somebody had 2 or 3 dogs and they happened to have a litter of puppies, that they would then need to register, pay an inspection, or pay a registration fee, get inspected, and get a license from the Board of Animal Health. So that was the negotiation to get up to that number. Again, as Nancy mentioned earlier, there were others that said it should be 40. You shouldn't be inspected until you have 40 animals. And so, there's a lot of, whether 10 or more is the right number or not, we're not entirely sure, but at least I think it's a good start. I think there's a question.
Yeah, quick question. When Nancy just said that the show dogs were not part of that tag, could you explain that just a little bit more? Because I think that's going to be helpful for people.
If people are breeding their dogs for the purpose of showing them, not for the purpose of selling to the public or like a livelihood.
Could I just ask you a question that I would have? So if you're advising somebody who has, let's just say 12 dogs, but, this is where the problem comes in. Some of the people who are the show breeders have dogs, you know, they'll go look at the puppies and some will be show dogs and some will be sold for puppy quality. How does that sort of work?
Again, they have to meet that threshold of 10 or more that are used for the purpose of sale. So if they have 12 and they're using 3 for the purpose of sale to the public, they don't fall under the law. If they have 4 litters a year, they don't fall under the law. So you have to meet all of those thresholds to be covered under the law. So if they're breeding to show 6 litters, and then they say, well, I'm going to sell 4 of these puppies, they wouldn't fall under the law. So you have to meet all the thresholds.
I have a question about this, and this covers 2 different topic areas. Breeders who might allegedly be considered unethical because they are breeding either with deliberate disregard for certain genetic factors that make the animal likely to have certain characteristics that force it to suffer its whole life, whether it's the bone problems or skin problems or whatever. I mean, you've got some of these, the miniaturization of some breeds has come under scrutiny. With breeders who are breeding solely for aesthetic purposes, and the animals may allegedly have some chronic and recurring genetic defect that causes them to suffer. Is this something that would fall under the jurisdiction of humane agents? And is that something that could be addressed in inspections with some of these larger breeders that are they're miniaturizing breeds
Yeah,
at quite an alarming rate?
that isn't part of the law. Genetics in the pet lemon law, if you get a sick puppy or kitten from a breeder or a pet shop, you have recourse in a certain time frame, but this law doesn't cover genetics.
Yeah, and I think it would be difficult, obviously. I think you make a really good point. But if you remember the slides that we had back a few slides ago with the horrific situations and the real obvious cruelty issues, I mean, we were having difficulty even getting that recognized. So I think you make a really good point, but maybe down the road. I think, as we said, more work to do. I would just comment on the slides too, the pictures. We were in such a catch-22 with this law, because we had people that would say, well, there is no problem here in Minnesota. Then we would have, in the exact same committee, we would have committee chairs say, there is no way I'm allowing you to show those pictures.
So what do we do?
So we can't show the pictures, but there's no problem. So it was very, very, very difficult for us, again, to thread that needle. We didn't want to show pictures unnecessarily, but when people say there is no problem in the state of Minnesota, how else are we going to prove it to them, except to show them the pictures? So again, this was a controversial, difficult piece of legislation. I'm doing this? Okay, so the law has a lot of penalties. There are civil penalties, administrative. The Board of Animal Health can issue correction orders. They have the ability to administratively have penalties up to $5,000 per violation. One time in the bill that was $10,000. That was one piece that was negotiated. I'll leave it at that. They can refuse to issue a license or to reissue a license. They can suspend or revoke licenses. They can issue cease and desist orders. It is in the bill. It's a misdemeanor to operate or advertise without a license, or to falsify information through the process of breeder if they falsify information through their license application or otherwise. Then, of course, we still have the criminal penalties for violating existing anti-cruelty laws.
Also included in the law, the board must refuse to issue an initial license if a breeder is in violation with specific existing laws under chapters 343 and 346. Those are our anti-cruelty statutes. If they're in violation of the breeder law, local ordinances that each county can pass stricter ordinances than state law. Ever had a license revoked or suspended, or if they've been convicted of cruelty to animals. In the bill also, there's a special breeder licensing revenue fund set up, which means all of the licensing fees collected, any penalties collected, those all go back into the fund to be appropriated to administer the law.
I'm going to go quickly through this because I do see we're running over on our time. Let's see, what a breeder that's covered under the requirements that Nancy mentioned earlier, they apply for a license, they pay a fee of $10 per adult intact animal, up to $250. We've talked about being in compliance with existing laws and the requirements of this law. They have to establish and maintain a written veterinary protocol. You can see what that would involve. And then they provide a vet health certificate within 30 days prior to sale of the animal. Yeah, thank you. And they must submit an annual report of number of animals sold, euthanized, deceased, given away, leased, brokered. And they must keep and identify records on each of the animals, and they must display their license at the facility, and also on all advertisements and websites, etc. So that we thought was a really important piece of the law, because we had a number of people say, well, how's a consumer going to know if a breeder is licensed or not? And so we thought this was, and even the symbol and license number were contentious issues as well. I mean, that's how detailed this bill got. But we think that's really an important piece of the law, is to educate the consumer on whether a breeder is in fact licensed under the state.
And then what we did in the law, besides having breeders comply with existing anti-cruelty statutes, we also had to include provisions that weren't ever in our cruelty statutes because we never had anything regulating breeders. So real quickly, cats cannot be housed outdoors, animals exercised in groups must be compatible and can't be sick or show signs of illness. Females in heat can't be housed with unneutered males except for breeding purposes. As you can imagine, there's a lot of fighting going on. Daily enrichment and positive physical contact with humans and compatible animals twice daily. That was very contentious, very difficult to explain during hearings, but it's a very important piece to this law. Puppies, kittens cannot be sold, traded, given away prior to 8 weeks of age, and the breeder must provide adequate staff to maintain the facility in order to observe each animal daily and to monitor their health and well-being.
What citizens should do, I would say stay engaged. And if you do see anything that you don't think is right, call the Board of Animal Health. And I think that would be that. Health and happiness is
Yes. Thanks for the question. You said that you can inspect to see if there are 10 or more animals on the facility. So what if there aren't, but there's a violation? Can you, the Board of Animal Health, do anything?
Yeah, that would be for Beth to answer.
Yeah, I will get to that. Who asked you asked the question.
I did.
So, let me pull, I can't do two things at once.
Sure.
I'm computer challenged, so.
How often do they have to renew the license?
Annual.
That's once a year. Yeah, by June 30th. We run on the fiscal year. Even better, I found it. By way of background, my name is Beth Thompson. I am a farm girl. I grew up in South Dakota. Early on, my dad and my family raised cattle, feeder cattle, until I was about 5 or 6 years old. And then when I was a teenager, we built a couple of hog barns. My family continues to be very involved in agriculture. My dad has passed, but my brother took over the farm. And now my nephew, who is 40 years old, is stepping into his shoes. We don't have the livestock anymore, but we do have grain. We've got over 5,000 acres in South Dakota that they raise corn and soybeans. So I myself, after college, went on to law school. I'm a graduate of William Mitchell of 1992. I had the mistaken idea that if I worked full-time and went to school at night, I would save money. Yeah, and it took me 4 years, and I came out with just as much debt. But I was over here talking to one of the classes last week, the law school classes, and I walked out of William Mitchell in 1992 with $30,000 worth of debt, and I thought that was huge.
Okay.
And now it's nothing. It's absolutely nothing compared to what they're walking out with now. I practiced in a small firm. 1992, the number of lawyers in Minnesota was just skyrocketing, and the law firm that I had been clerking for offered me a position. It was in Anoka, and I worked for the city attorney's office. It was also a private law firm, so worked there for a little bit. Really wanted to get back into agriculture, so a few years later, a position opened up in St. Cloud, and I went up there and worked for the remainder of my career in law. Did get back into agriculture a little bit, not as much as I wanted. I had a diabetic cat. I am going somewhere with this story. I had a diabetic cat. I was in with the veterinarian that had been working with, and his name was Higgins. Working with Higgins, she was a first year out of Iowa State. Said something about, we were talking about physiology and diabetes and all of that, and I looked at her and I said, and this is one of those, my brain was working and it hooked up with my mouth and it came out of my mouth right away. I said, if I had to do it all over again, I'd really like to be a veterinarian. And she said to me, so what's stopping you? So a few years later, I found myself in vet school. So I am a lawyer and veterinarian. My 84-year-old mom still introduces me as a lawyer. The Board of Animal Health, and maybe I should have gone first because not too many, how many people here, other than this presentation, have heard of the Board of Animal Health? Oh, well, okay, so most people don't know who we are. They don't realize we're a state agency. The Board of Animal Health came out of the Department of Health. Back in around 1900, there's this disease known as glanders. It was a respiratory disease of horses. It was also a zoonotic disease, meaning that it affects people too. And the Department of Health is trying to deal with that, and they got the idea that maybe we should have a veterinarian on staff. So they pulled in a veterinarian. There was also tuberculosis that was running around the state at that time. So right around 1900 is when the Board of Animal Health got its start. We are truly a board. And this was our first board up on the left-hand side here, but on the right-hand side, I'm missing one picture, but by statute, the Board of Animal Health has 3 members that come from the large livestock groups in Minnesota. That would be cattle, hogs, and poultry. And then the other 2 members are veterinarians. And our new veterinarian, I don't have a picture of him yet. So we're not, the reason it's set up that way and the livestock groups like it that way is that we're not politically motivated. That as the governors come in, and it's a staggered term for our members, as those people go through the board, then new governors will appoint new members of the board. We're not red, we're not blue, we're not something in between. We serve the livestock groups of Minnesota. Up until a couple of years ago, we really truly were a livestock board. That's what we focused on. We did have, well, we deal with rabies, and of course that every once in a while that we see that in dogs and cats. And we also have a kennel program. But for the most part, we deal with livestock. And many of you probably have heard of the avian influenza that is running around the state right now. Huge, huge issue. It's a foreign animal disease. We've got over 20 farms that have been affected. It's in 14 or 15 counties at this point. We've got USDA here. So those are the issues that the board normally deals with. And I do have to tell all of you, in the last 2 months, I've had half a day off. That's how big it is. And James mentioned going over to the legislature. I was just over there in the last couple of days talking to those folks about this issue. So that's a little background on the Board of Animal Health. Talking about the dog and cat breeder bill, and I just you guys have it in your handouts, just to pull up that definition. What we are looking at is that person who possesses or has an ownership interest in animals and is engaged in the business of breeding those animals. And as we pointed out in the last presentation, we're looking at those people who possess 10 or more, and that the number of litters that's required for them to fall into the law. Right now, I checked before I left, I think we have 15, and these are all, I believe they're all, how can I say that? I think they're all dog breeders. I don't believe that we have any cat breeders that are licensed. Is there one? There might be, okay, so one cattery that's licensed at this point, and there are 4 or 5 that are in the queue for licensing. Yes?
Is 15 realistic?
As far as the number of breeders in the state of Minnesota, probably not. Now there again, and James and Nancy can probably comment on this, throughout the years, we've heard all sorts of numbers being bandied about as far as how many breeders are in the state of Minnesota. I heard upwards of 800 at one point. Then it started backing down to about 650, and that was the last number that I heard. In speaking with our field staff, we have staff that are located throughout the state of Minnesota. I would hazard a guess of 200. I might be wrong, but those folks are out there, they know their communities, they know who's involved with breeding dogs and cats because they've lived there most of their lives, and that's about the number that we're getting to at that point. Now, having said that, we don't have the people that are here in suburban Minneapolis, St. Paul, and those folks that may be breeders, so.
Tell me if this is accurate. I read that in Minnesota we are the state, one of the state, if not the state, with the largest puppy mill concentration, and that much of that is attributed to the Amish population, who regard dogs as more, and all livestock as livestock more objectified, and that they really do have the primary concentration of puppy mills.
And I can't speak to if they have the primary concentration of breeding animals, but I do know there is one group that's down in southeastern Minnesota. Our field staff has a pretty good relationship with that group. Now we're talking about people who don't have phones, who don't have electricity.
So they wouldn't register.
Well, but our field staff did contact them, and we used them as I'll call it a practice run on an inspection. So we do have contact with some of those groups, but that was southeastern Minnesota. I'm not really aware if there are more throughout the state. I'm sure there are other folks like that.
Does your 200 include people that would fall below this number because you have 2 or 3 breeding animals?
No, that was over and above anything that would be covered by the statute. Anybody else have any questions?